I mean, Babiš has said quite clearly on Czech TV on Saturday night that he doesn't want to form a coalition with TOP 09 and ODS because these are the symbols of 20 years of corruption in Czech politics, which in a way is, the more, although it's difficult to define the kind of ideology of movements like Babiš's, given his pro-business views, the more obvious kind of partner on the scene would be an ODS or a TOP 09. So that leaves him then, that kind of excludes those possibilities, and we're looking at then some kind of a deal between Babiš and ČSSD. I'm maybe not quite as optimistic about the future of Bohuslav Sobotka as Katya. In terms of coalitions, it seems to me there's two things that could be interesting. One, I think we could probably put a fair bet down that the most likely party to be in any coalition is KDU-ČSL. They're traditional coalition partners of everybody anyway. The other interesting thing is that not very many people have really talked seriously about Úsvit being in coalition. It was, again, very interesting in Czech TV on Saturday night that this option wasn't discussed. Now we can maybe come back to Úsvit and quite what he wants or how he could be bought off at some point. But I see that could be a potential deal done somewhere. But I think it's going to be extremely difficult to form a government, and I think the president is in quite a strong position in that sense. And maybe actually from Zeman's point of view, if you continue with Rusnok government for a long period of time might be his preferred option.
Maybe Rusnok is the real winner from of the election, because it will take at least 2 or 3 months to form a government, maybe longer, and of course he'll be been governing for the best part of 6, 7, 8 months. So the default option is Rusnok. And of course he doesn't need a majority. He can continue governing as a prime minister in resignation for indefinitely. Just a couple of comments there. The one thing I think with we haven't touched on is, particularly with these new parties, is particularly assuming that Andrej Babiš is drawn into a kind of coalition, which I think is likely, because I mean, if you think about a minority government with Christian Democrats and Social Democrats, they would have a paltry 64 votes in a 200-member assembly. And the question would be, if Babiš and his party are drawn into a formal coalition, who is going to represent them in government? If we look at Babiš's candidates and the people standing for his party, they're not seasoned politicians. They're fairly, they're people with some kind of professional substance to them. So they're business people, they're civil servants. There are even a few university lecturers there, but they're not people who are can immediately step into ministerial office and do a good job. So I think if what we may see, just picking up the theme of technocratic government, is that Babiš will choose independence. Okamura, I think we can come back to, but I think there are reasons why nobody wants to go near him. The first thing is because of his extremist rhetoric. I mean, I don't think he is politically, ideologically on the extreme right, but he's someone who's pragmatic to opportunistic, and some of the things he has said, like that Roma should go off to India and found their own state, this is absolutely kind of beyond the pale, and we don't know how long his party will be around. I mean, there are questions for both new parties about how stable their parliamentary groups will be. If we look at we've touched on the Civic Democrats and their predicament already, and we've said that it's not as disastrous as it could be, but it's still pretty disastrous. And I think it marks this party's decline from a major party, a major player, to minor party status. I thought that, in fact, I guess in hindsight, I wouldn't be surprised that they didn't melt down, because if you look at the kind of the advice that disgraced and declining ruling parties are given, they've done almost everything right since the exit of Petr Nečas, and there's this disastrous kind of collapse and exit from government. They've done many of the things that many consultants, I think, would recommend them to do. They've replaced their leader. They've chosen someone who is relatively kind of credible in Miroslava Němcová. She's not formally the leader, but she headed the party's campaign. They chose a woman as leader, which is unheard of in Czech politics. I think there's only ever been one Czech political party led by a woman, which is Hana Marvanová, when she briefly led the Freedom Union. They waged a kind of vague, feel-good campaign, didn't make any promises, which again is what you should do if you're a kind of disgraced ruling party trying to claw things back. And they do seem to have tried to weed out some of the more discredited characters from their list of candidates, and yet they have still ended up in quite a bad place. Top 09 have declined from 16% in the previous election to just under 12%, and I think can be relieved that they haven't done worse, as some of the polls suggested that they would, and that they have displaced ODS as the larger party of the Czech right. But I think they have a number of problems which paradoxically the Civic Democrats don't have. They are very dependent on the popular personality of Karel Schwarzenberg, who, because of his age and his health, is, and he has said this, is not likely to be around in Czech politics much longer. This leaves them with their number two, and some people would say de facto leader, the much less popular ex-finance minister Miroslav Kalousek, who, although he's a very forcible advocate for market reform, does have connections with business groups and has a somewhat shady reputation. I won't say whether it's justified or not, but he has that reputation. The party is very, very Prague-centric. If you look at where they get their votes, they're very heavily weighed towards Prague. The Civic Democrats can at least even now claim to be a national party. And unlike the Civic Democrats, Top 09 have very little in the way of organisation. They have about 3,000 or 4,000 members. They've deliberately not built up their membership. They're very dependent at grassroots level on this other grouping, the Mayors and Independents grouping, who may look at them and think, well, do we really want to be part of this alliance anymore? The theme that's being talked about at the moment is integration of the right. We have three, or if we include Andrej Babiš, 4 centre-right parties, and the logic of their position is that they should cooperate and to seek to rebuild some kind of bloc. But of course, the 64,000 crown question is, how on earth do they do this? It's one thing to form a coalition, but electoral coalitions featuring several parties in the Czech Republic, certainly, and in other places as well, don't have a very good history. If we think of, for example, the so-called Quad coalition of the mid-1990s, which was kind of centre-right grouping, which was opposed to both the Civic Democrats and the Social Democrats. This grouping was very promising, very electorally successful, but it founded on the fact that it was too difficult to integrate such kind of different organisations. The final question about who is the future of the right, we should take a second look at Andrej Babiš and his party. I mean, Tim's mentioned that Babiš is kind of right-leaning, and being a billionaire, you could, can you be a left-wing billionaire? Babiš's movement's programme was right-leaning in some ways, but left-leaning in others, and some of the anti-corruption policies are very similar to Social Democrats. Some of the other policies, like on pension reform, were kind of right-leaning. And it's clear that Babiš's advisors, who is the American PR company PSB, clearly advised him to tack to the right. And as far as we can tell, I don't think any exit polls were done, but other people have sort of done some kind of statistical inference. It appears that Andrej Babiš drew mainly on right-wing voters. And the problem for him now is going to be how he consolidates his new party. And one way for him to do that may be, indeed, to become a Berlusconi-esque figure, not simply in the sense that he is going to, he's a rich man in politics with his own party, but by trying to be a kind of integrating factor for the centre-right. But the future of the right could easily be Andrej Babiš, who has already tried to kind of recruit independent movements and integrate other smaller political groups into his movement unsuccessfully. But it's clearly occurred to him to do that.
Would you?
Just quickly, is that all right?
Yeah, go for it.
Lest I forget the point. But, no, Babiš, I think that the key, this is where very little has been said about the economy, the state of the economy in this election, which is actually very surprising because the Czech economy has only just emerged from recession after 6 consecutive quarters of contraction. Babiš, one of his mandates at this election was to represent, as Seán said, that's been a right-wing element of his programme, to represent business, to help attract new investment, to boost growth. And that is certainly one way of helping the economic recovery which is now underway. I think that factor, that element of his programme was critical to his success. And as I said, ANO is a broad ideological church, and that was one of the statements on the right of his programme which he made on the right wing. The other important point, going back to the results of Top 09 and ODS, one of the reasons why ODS did so badly and Top 09 actually did better, I think, than expected, one of the reasons why the right has sort of bottomed out at this election is because the vote for Babiš's ANO was in certain respects a vote against austerity. And austerity, this is a Europe-wide trend. You don't just see it in the Czech Republic, you've seen it in Italy as well, and I think actually Babiš can probably be better compared with Pepe Grillo of the Five Star Movement rather than Berlusconi. But I think his party may be actually a bit more, his movement may be a bit more serious than Pepe Grillo's movement. But certainly austerity was a big thing at this election, and so the results of the right wing, the traditional right wing parties, centre-right parties who formed the previous government, they definitely suffered at this election because of the austerity measures associated with their time in government.
Just to pick up on a couple of things which I think probably worth stressing. I mean, Top 09 is interesting. Seán's absolutely right to say it's heavily dependent on Karel Schwarzenberg. Noticeable again, I think the second election in a row he got the largest number of preference votes of any politician. No real surprise there. What's very interesting about Schwarzenberg, this was more noticeable during the presidential election than perhaps this time round, but it's also how many young Czechs have jumped on his bandwagon. And it's interesting, if you look at the stats in terms of Facebook friends and internet activity, then Top 09 scores very, very highly indeed. So it's this strange coalition in a way between a rather old man and very young Czech voters, mostly based in Prague. Second, just a minor point which leads off from one thing that Seán said about Cuba. And what's interesting, actually, it's noticeable he didn't get into Parliament, and in fact, preference votes this time round proved to be less significant than last time round.
One point to flag though about the right, if we include Andrej Babiš and his party as being on the centre-right, and we take his representation, the Civic Democrats, Top 09, and the Christian Democrats, who are sometimes regarded as centrist, but like other Christian Democrats are on the centre-right, I think that bloc, that hypothetical four-party bloc, would have a majority. Obviously, Andrej Babiš says he doesn't want to have anything to do with the Civic Democrats or Top 09. Possibly they don't want to have much to do with him. But what's interesting is that Czech politics, as ever, is amazingly finely balanced between left and right. And this is one of the underlying factors that makes government formation so difficult. Or to put it another way, Czechs kind of by default tend to vote for the centre even where there isn't a kind of coherent centre. Okay, shall we segue off into Anno 2011?
Yeah, into Babiš. So we've said quite a few things already, but maybe just for the benefit of the non-Czech experts, maybe say a couple of things about him. So Babiš does have a slightly imperfect, slightly shady background from certain perspectives. Certainly he does have a communist background, although he was very keen to kind of dismiss this and saying that he was working abroad. I think he was based in Morocco, if I'm right, yeah. And that he was doing things for the Czechoslovak state at that particular point. He came back soon after the changes. He formed this company, Agrofest, and he is now an extremely rich man. He's on the Forbes list. The second thing to say about his background, but there have certainly been question marks in terms of linkage between him and the communist-era security service. The second interesting thing about Babiš I find quite interesting is, this is a Slovak guy who, it's interesting, when he's on Czech TV, you can hear the Slovak from time to time, and you can also hear him almost correcting himself on occasions when he speaks a little bit of Slovak, or says the odd Slovak word. What's interesting about Babiš, we haven't spoken so much about the campaign so much, but he was the real winner through the campaign. And what was quite interesting is that from the opinion pollsters who were on Czech TV on Saturday night and Sunday talking about this, that one of the important events was Babiš appearing on the Jan Kraus show. For those of you who don't know Jan Kraus, it's a bit like Jay Leno's Tonight Show. We don't really have an equivalent, I think, in the UK. Sort of a mixture of entertainment and politics and all sorts of things like that. But that seemed to help spike his support. If we look, Sean kind of mentioned about where the support came from. Just looking at some, as a post by Kamil Gregor on...
this is what we're looking.
Yeah, on, I think it's Ihned.
Koho volit, yeah.
Yeah, Koho volit, which was a very interesting graph. I'm slightly nervous about taking too much from it, but what's interesting is if you look at that, where Anno's support came from this time, it did come from largely from the right, from the Civic Democratic Party, from TOP 09, and a significant slice from public affairs. Very little, according to this analysis, came from ČSSD. I'm not sure how much weight we should lay on that particular analysis, but it's kind of interesting. The second kind of new party, I mean, Sean has probably said the key things about Okamura already, but just to perhaps say, I mean, it's very interesting going to his website and looking at his call for direct democracy, and there's this huge spiel in which he makes reference just about every political thinker, politician. He makes reference to Edvard Beneš and others saying no political parties were never going to be good for the Czech system. It's quite an interesting read, and certainly every single sentence I think that Okamura articulated on TV on Saturday, he used the word direct democracy, or the phrase direct democracy, in every single sentence. I'm still not entirely sure quite what this means in practical terms. If you could construct some kind of a law which made it perhaps easier to hold referendum, could he be bought off? I don't know. But I think the key thing to mention with both of these two groupings, I just wonder how many of these people will stay together in this grouping for that long, for both Úsvit and for Babiš. These people will get into parliament. Can they be persuaded to join other factions? But I think that these could be potentially very fragile groupings, and that could actually, we could see movement of a number of individuals there elsewhere. I don't know what kind of deals behind the scenes have been struck.
And I think, Tim, just to come back, we've talked about Babiš. We also need to look at his party or his movement, which is in fact pretty well organised and has drawn on the resources of his firm, Agrofert, and it's managed and organised by people from this company. And the question is, can he can he consolidate this movement, and can he build it into anything?
Can I mention one other thing?
Yep.
Sorry, there's one thing that I forgot to say, which is important about Babiš, is of course his company owns two of the leading Czech newspapers now, and that's Mladá Fronta Dnes and Lidovky. So that is one reason why he's often been more used the Berlusconi label. I think that's an important point.
May I just come back on one point about fragmentation, which feeds in something that Seán mentioned, which is that that is one sort of downside risk to Babiš's party staying as a sort of stable, cohesive force in the new parliament, in whichever shape that is the potential for whether or not Babiš decides to put forward basically technocratic ministers and a new government, whether they're going to be independents or technocrats. The potential for fragmentation really comes down to the key decisions that Babiš now makes if his party gets into government, and if those people who get into government actually decide to carry the ANO badge. I think that's just following on from what Seán said, that much now comes down to the type of coalition government we're going to see.
But the other parties are potentially unattractive. I mean, Babiš damn near won the election. If the election had been a week later, he might have just beaten social democracy. So, if in previous scenarios when MPs have been surprisingly persuaded to change their vote at the last minute, it's been in the context of big, powerful centre-right, centre-left parties, when the Social Democrats and the Civic Democrats were still a force in Czech politics. So, I would have thought that I mean, say with Okamura's party, I would bet, I bet the farm that it won't be around in a year's time. Certainly not as a parliamentary group. But with Babiš, I think there's a much more realistic prospect of building some kind of stable centre-right force if he plays his cards right. Do we want to sort of go into Okamura more, or shall we move on to
Actually, one other thing we should say about Okamura is his party, of those that got into Parliament, is the party with the strongest anti-European sentiment. I think that's probably worth saying. I mean, actually, Babiš is much more kind of mildly.
But Europe didn't really feature.
It didn't feature at all.
I mean,
but Okamura did make play of that.
True, but he's been banging. I mean, I think he just shifts his ground according to what he thinks will benefit him. So he started off talking about running the Czech Republic like a firm, and then Andrej Babiš comes along, and he's a rather more credible figure to run the Czech Republic like a firm. So Okamura shifts to this rhetoric about direct democracy and the political class and Bates, Roma, and so on. So that's kind of interesting, but it's more interesting by the fact that nobody else in Europe is just not around.
It doesn't play.
Absolutely not around as an issue. Shall we then talk about the policy implications of this very uncertain political situation? Because I mean, Babiš does have some policies, and there will be some sort of wheeling and dealing to do with policies. So, do you want to sort of
should I kick off
and suggest where it might be taking us?
Yeah, I mean, obviously this election, I mean, depending on what the kind of coalition that's now put together, it has clear implications for policy. The centre-right government, before it collapsed in mid-June, had put together quite a sort of convincing package of sort of centre-right policies on healthcare, on pensions, and taxation. The Social Democratic Party, which I think the consensus is it is going to form part of the new coalition, has basically set out its stall in saying that it intends to unpack those policies put forward by the previous centre-right government. So one of its policy mandates, which appeared in the election campaign manifesto, is to essentially get rid of the second pillar of the private pension system. Now, this is, I think, going to be one of the key areas where Babiš may actually clash with the current head of the Social Democratic Party, Sobotka, or indeed any head of the Social Democratic Party, whether it's Sobotka or Hašek or whoever. I think that the Social Democrats are unlikely to yield on this policy, but Babiš has sort of clearly said that he wants some at least watered down version of the second pillar to stay in place, which obviously represents his views on private pensions versus state-supported pensions, which is inevitable for a centre-right movement, as we've categorised it as a centre-right movement. So this is going to be one key policy area to watch. The other one, given Babiš's reputation and standing as a businessman, is on corporate taxation. Babiš has clearly said he doesn't want a new government of any ideological hue to hike up corporate taxes on businesses, small firms or banks. And this is going to be another area, given its topicality in Europe right now. Let's tax the banks, to push down debt levels. This is going to be another area where the two may clash. However, I think Babiš is a clever chap, and I think he is capable of making the transition from businessman to politician. I think he will undoubtedly have a taste for power now. He will see how well his party, his movement has done, and he will want to be part of a new government. And therefore, I think he will probably be willing to make some concessions, but he won't be willing to meet the Social Democrats full way. He will probably want to meet them halfway. But this is actually where the Christian Democrats, the Garde UÇSL, could be important, because there are some common areas of policy between them and Babiš's ANO. There are some points where they see eye to eye, for instance, on church restitution, for instance, which was a big issue under the previous centre-right government. It was the church restitution policy that essentially pushed up the Czech Republic's fiscal deficit last year. So there are some common areas between ANO and Garde UÇSL, and I think that actually during these negotiations in the next few days, if ANO can sidle up to Garde UÇSL more and agree a common strategy before they are approached by the Social Democrats, they could go some way into smoothing over the rough edges of their ideological agenda, if I can put it like that. So there is scope. It's limited, but if everybody gives a little, which is unlikely in Czech politics, but if everybody gave a little way to reach a consensus, we could have a new coalition government by the end of the week, although that is unlikely.
By January or February.
Exactly.
I think Czech politicians are actually very good at doing deals.
Well,
they do them slowly,
yeah.
but they're kind of masters of kind of cobbling together unusual but workable arrangements. I mean, it's okay. Tim, do you want to come in?
I maybe would like to just make one other point about Babiš, if I may. I mean, he said different things about whether he wants to be in government or not. And maybe Katya's right that that's the way that he will eventually go. One of the things that's worth saying about Babiš and his company is, I mean, he's run his company extremely well, but he runs it in he's quite a strong leader of his company, and he only in the last during the election campaign kind of passed over a few things to somebody else. I'm not sure what it's going to be like if you're a minister from Babiš's party in a government. I'm not sure how easy that's going to be. But no, I just think it's really difficult to say the policy implications. I think it's going to be it's going to take a long time to strike a deal. It's going to be quite messy. I'm not sure really at this stage. I think it's too difficult to say.
But I think one thing that may be off the agenda is that we clearly don't have a government of the left. Though everyone expected, I think, was this the Economist forecast? That we would have a minority social democratic government supported by communist votes, and that the communists would exact some kind of concessions, some kind of policy concessions, and that we'd have a government which was clearly of the left. And that, unless Babiš's party kind of collapses, and we kind of have a morass of kind of independents and factions and so on, within the parliament, then the communist influence is not going to be as great as people thought it was. Although I noticed that the first meeting the Social Democrats had was with the communists, so they clearly don't want to throw them overboard. And in some ways, it's understandable why they don't, because whatever the politically unattractive face of the communists, they are a very well structured, very well organised party. You do a deal with them. You know that they will stick to it. You know that they'll be around, and with Babish's party or others, you simply don't know what's going to happen.
I agree. I mean, I think in a way, what would have been the most interesting thing in this election if Ceausescu had done well and quite what position they would have taken on the communists. I think that would have been really interesting, but unfortunately that's not on the
this sort
agenda.
of segues into the final theme, which is that what we thought we might get, but what we are not going to get, is a kind of conventional party government resting on a coalition. Well, the Communists and Social Democrats, it would have been more of a kind of pact, but between two conventional, well-established programmatic parties who are kind of fixtures in politics. And I think our last kind of set of things we just wanted to say sometimes was, what does this all mean for the future of Czech democracy? And I think what it may mean is that, first of all, the old party system, which was based on the kind of twin pillars of the Civic Democrats and the Social Democrats, was established in the 1990s. That is gone. We're in a new kind of political landscape. In a sense, the decline of ODS, decline of the Czech right, is also a blow for the Social Democrats, because when they had to deal with the right, compete with the right, they knew their enemy, they knew who they were, they knew what politics is about. Now we don't know that anymore. And the other thing that was established in the 1990s was the idea that Czech democracy, and this is actually in the constitution, was based upon political parties. It was party government, is the phrase political scientists use. Parties, are voted for by voters, are responsible for voters, are put across a certain programme, and then are around to answer for it at the next election. And that seems to be something that we are moving away from now. We're likely to see maybe many more technocratic and independent ministers. We're likely to see the president playing a much bigger role, either brokering a government or in appointing governments directly. We have these unusual political animals like ANO, which is really a coalition of independents. Okamura's party is effectively a coalition of all kinds of strange groups and parties. So we seem to be kind of moving away from this. The character of Czech democracy does seem to be changing, and it seems to be moving in a less party-centred direction. Whether that is a good thing or not, we don't know.
Just briefly, I mean, this feeds into a debate currently ongoing in political science circles and among Czech intellectuals about the significance of this semi-presidential system that we essentially can see developing. Some analysts think that this election will actually feed into strengthening that semi-presidential system, i.e. a fragmented parliament gives Miloš Zeman a free hand to call the shots, and to some degree he's been calling the shots since mid-June when the old government collapsed. So I think that I would agree with Seán's point that the character of the party political system is changing, and that the president will be looking to stamp his authority on this election in the days ahead. So I think that not only is Babiš somebody to watch, I think the other key player to watch is Miloš Zeman.
Yeah, I would say, just one thing, I think I would agree with the analysis, maybe a couple of things to just flag out which I think are interesting. It's not completely new for the Czech Republic to have technocratic ministers or caretaker governments. Actually it's the third one. And interestingly enough, the Tušovský and Fischer governments were the two most popular governments, I think, in the Czech Republic's history. What's been amazing for a long time is how many Czechs have said that they hate their politicians, and yet the party system is remarkably stable. In many respects, it's a more fluid party system, or more fragile one, actually reflects underlying Czech opinions, I think. Yeah, and in many respects, it is quite a mess now, I think. I think what will be very interesting, I think the big question marks will be about these two new parties and how robust they prove to be, and whether they will actually die off before the next election and be replaced by something else, which would be my expectation. The second thing is, I would say that there are, although we keep talking about the kind of instability, there are two signs of some stability in a way. The return to government, parliament of KDU-ČSL is, I think, quite significant. And actually the Greens, which we haven't really talked about, did reasonably well, had quite a good campaign in many respects, and managed to cross the 3% threshold, which gives them some state funding.
Gives them yearly state funding. For their operating costs.
So what is interesting is, although this looks again as if the party system has kind of changed significantly, that two players that used to be on the parliamentary scene, in some respects, in different ways, are kind of back. So maybe it's not such of a change as we think.